Okay, so we're Revelation 12. Hang on, I've got the remote. So I adjusted it so we know where we are. Let's see if I can do just to play. Okay, so it's been a lot, and I struggled because, believe me, there's like Revelation 12, there is so much. I said to Gary, the rabbit trails, they're glorious, they're wonderful, they're exciting, interesting, all of that. But guys, you'll be proud of me. I've kept it as high level as I can, touching on stuff, and I'm sure you'll have questions. That's fine. I don't mind questions, but I couldn't go into detail too much. So, but the stuff I've got is, I think, is phenomenal. Right. So looking back, I've kind of high-leveled the looking back as well. We now know, looking back, that John is kind of very intentional about his use of the Old Testament. He has references. He has significant awareness of the Old Testament. So what we're starting to see and starting to learn is that actually a lot of the vision is symbolic and not literal, all right? Well, that's how I've seen it. The stuff that I'm looking at is less literal and more symbolic. Eugene Boring, how's that for a name as a scholar? Sorry, guy. So he says that it would be a violation of Revelation's mode of communication to attempt to summarize its message in a manner that would make the text itself unnecessary. So in other words, we've got to stay in the vision of it. We've got to, what John saw could not necessarily be expressed in words alone, even though he wrote it down. So I want you to activate your imagination when you read Revelation and think about the images that they're kind of pitting against each other. And you'll see what I mean as we go down. Like, think about, we had a bit of that in Revelation 4 where, you think you've got this Lion of Judah, whatever, and he turns and he sees a lamb. It's that kind of thing. Like, think about those aspects of it. So our temptation as modern day Western people is that to jump in and we want to try and explain it all away. But let's sit in the mystery of Scripture and be okay with that. That's kind of what I'm saying to you is, you know what? It's okay. There's a mystery in all of this, and that's what we want to sit in, right? So, the command of Revelation, and yes, there is a command. The command is to look. Anita said to me, and I remember this from when I studied art, is that we are taught in art is to draw what you see and not what you think you're seeing. And this is the same thing now. It's like God's wanting you to look and not what you think you're seeing. So we think we're seeing chaos in the world, and there's reality to that. But heaven's command, Revelation's command, Jesus' command, look into the reality of heaven. Okay, so that's our true reality, right? So we start off by hearing, but we want to go deeper. Like I said, activate your imagination. Allow yourself to become curious about why is it saying this instead of that? Why is it using these kinds of adjectives about, let's say, the dragon, and yet saying this about Jesus? What is it doing? What's the tone? And guess what? Even the clever guys, those guys who've written books on it and studied Revelation for years, and we are not, Lifehouse is not original in this. This is not our stuff. We're getting stuff from guys who've studied this for years. Some people spend all their life studying one aspect in biblical academics, and we're getting stuff from there. But even those guys are not that clever that they know everything. Anybody who says that, I would be nervous. We work in the plausible and not the definites. Okay. So I'm not saying this stuff is definite. I'm saying this stuff is plausible. Perhaps. It makes more sense maybe on this side, knowing who God is. But it's definitely not definite, because guess what? We don't know. And that's okay. Right. So our challenge as modern people is that what we do is we tend to approach biblical interpretation as we interpret literally, and then unless we're forced to interpret it symbolically. Now, Beale, he's like mind-blowingly clever. These guys are very intelligent. He suggests that perhaps we should interpret symbolically unless we're forced to interpret literally. It's a little bit on its head in terms of what, so that's a challenge. You see, John's audience, which is what the letter was written to, not to us. It's written for us, but it's written to an ancient context, not our context. So their means of divine revelation was symbolic. So we have to put that all into our kind of framework of our grid of when we start reading a book like Revelation, or any kind of book in the Bible, to be honest. So if the main mode is symbolism, our challenge is Westerners, how do we interpret these symbols? Great question. Some of the symbols are clearly defined. So the other challenges you get in Revelation 1:20, where it says the 7 stars are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. It's pretty clear. It tells you that. Another one is the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. But then you get other symbols that aren't defined whatsoever. They're just there, and we have no idea. So that's why the context, Old Testament context, the Greco-Roman context, the history, Jewish interpretive context, all becomes pretty important. And it comes into play. Now, you guys are thinking, well, that sounds like hard work. Yep, it is. It's hard work going into another context to try and figure out if, like Dale and George, they're going back into Ukraine, a little easier, but it's hard work for them to go into that context and try and understand the context of where the Ukrainians live, what they're doing, and that's in the modern world, so it's hard work for us to understand the context of the Bible. God chose to write the Bible when he did, through the people that he did, through the circumstances. That's not my choice. But we have access to more information about the ancient context than ever before in any other period in the time. And there's some brilliant guys there, like John Walton, who helps unpack the stuff in easy ways. So that's a challenge. But we have an amazing access to information about the context in that day. So we have less excuse than it was even like 100 years ago in terms of understanding context. So, now that I've kind of challenged us all, the central focus. So Gary last week did obviously chapter 11. I can do numbers, right? 11, 12. Aren't you guys proud of me? I've always said I can count to 4 because I have 4 kids. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's as far as I can go. So this is a new window. Remember when Sherry talked about all the different windows of Revelation? So now it's opening up to a very special, highly central kind of window of Revelation. And I'll unpack a little bit more. Now we get to, and 11 and 12 are linked. So even though we have these different, like last week Gary did 11, this week I'm doing 12, it's actually linked and they kind of overlap each other. So even though we kind of separated, it's not separated. And I thought Gary did a really brilliant job. Well done, babe. You can come back. All right, so the imagery now, what happens is when you read kind of 11, 12, the scenes kind of move pretty quickly. They're kind of, oh, okay, we're in the temple of God, and then suddenly we're like, there's a woman in the sky and like pregnant and trying to give birth, and then there's a great dragon. So things happening really quickly. We even have the Ark of Covenant and what's going on, and it seems a bit, so you kind of, it's a part of the movie where things happen very quickly, but if you want to kind of slow down and just, okay, be present in the moment because it's pretty important. So now we're going to read 12. I was going to ask somebody, but I forgot to ask them, so I'll have to read it. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. Makes me giggle. With 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. They're kind of like crown thingies, the diadems. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,601. Wow, you see, this is why I don't do numbers. You guys will laugh at me later. 1,260 days. That's very specific, hey? Now, a war. Do you want to read this? A war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels is fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but then he was defeated. My favorite verse. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brothers have been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they have loved not their lives, even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she's to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. How odd. How oddly unspecific. Then the serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed the river, and that the dragon had poured out from its mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So highly bizarre, right? I mean, there's a lot of imagery there. There's a lot there. And it's weird. I mean, I don't know about you. So before we kind of move into this, I have to give you a grid. And the grid is what? And this is the grid for the whole book, the overarching grid for the entire Bible, and that's the gospel. You see, because we have to work from the claim of the gospel, and then we figure out the rest of the stuff. So what's the claim of the gospel? Jesus Christ, the risen King, has won the victory over all the forces that threaten to wipe us out. The kingdom, this is in chapter 11, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. So I feel like I can just sit down and go home now, right? But there's so much more. It's like I'm like a very mark ad today. However, we get questions that come up because of that claim. And these are the questions. I'm sure you've all, if not asked it, heard other people ask. If this gospel, this good news, is true, why are things so bad? And if evil has been defeated, why does evil still wreak such havoc in our world today? And we can't shy away from questions like that. In fact, the Bible doesn't, and we shouldn't. It's okay to ask questions like that. And guess what? Revelation answers some of this. So let's go back. I said they were linked. I just want to kind of reverse back. Let's go to Revelation 11 and just remind ourselves what is happening here. So the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom, this is what I read earlier, of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders who sat on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was. As Gary pointed out, there's no to come now. That's been removed. 4, you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, both great and small, for destroying the destroyers of the earth. There's some nice clues in there, guys. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. Now, I know we joke about the lightning and thunder, and it's very, very frightening, but it's actually pretty important to unpack. This Revelation temple scene is highly symbolic for an ancient Jewish mind. When they hear that kind of language, they're going to go back to many things in the Old Testament. So it's actually depicting something, it's signaling a couple of things. First of all, you've got the trumpet sounding. Guess what? It's not just like a trumpet that sounds to-do, to-do. There's so much more that what it means. So the Jewish New Year, also known as Rosh Hashanah, also known as the Day of the Trumpets. It's not just the beginning of their new year, like we go into like another year. It's the anniversary of the creation and the renewal of it. That's what's happening in their mindsets when they hear the seventh trumpet sounded. I hate this word, is so stupid. God's eschatological judgment was expected to fall on this day. That's what they're celebrating. It proclaimed hope in what? The ongoing ultimate judgment of God. He's going to deal with destroying the destroyers. It's God's judgment and reward. If you read the text again, it's talking about not only judgment, but it's talking about the rewards for the saints, those who have been faithful. And all of that combined is the final restoration of Israel. Okay. So for the ancient Jews, they believed, and this is interesting, is that actually it all links back to Genesis. Because they believed that when God made Adam and Eve, and he put them in the garden, he must have provided food for them. So the beginning starts in harvest season. Pretty interesting. Well, I think so. Maybe you're all looking at me as if I'm weird. It's okay. So not only do we find from Revelation, early Revelation, that there was a door open in heaven, now heaven itself, the temple itself is open and you can see the Ark of the Covenant. Think back, what does that remind you of? The veil is torn. The Holy of Holies. That's a sacred space. High priests were only allowed to go in there once a year. And they had a rope attached to them in case they did something really doff and didn't ritually, weren't ritually pure. They would die. That space is opened. It means that John is able to enter into that space. It's the invitation of come, look. So all of the thunder, the lightning, the words, all of this is signaling. All of this is speaking of, even think of Mount Sinai. If you read Mount Sinai and you're talking about what happens, it's God's presence that has come down to earth. This beautiful, sacred, a little scary space of God. So it's his activity and his presence, which is really cool. So Revelation 12 is your central access. And it's signaling something incredibly important, and it's called the Great Reversal. We've got the falls, you've got humanity, you've got the flood, Tower of Babel, you've got this, God promises Abraham, the story is pinnacle, and the pinnacle now is Jesus. And that's what it's all pointing to. So this temple scene of 11, linking into 12, is going, pay attention, something really important is coming, and it changes everything. It's what they call that literary chiasm. It's a framing technique. They did it in Mount Sinai. Have a look. Genesis, Exodus, all the stories of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they frame each other. If there's so many stories, 6 versions of this on this side, there's 6 versions of that on that side. So that's what Revelation 12 is. 1 to 11, building up. 12 is your pinnacle point. Now it's going to mirror down and point to. It's all pointing to the same thing. I think it's marvelously, brilliantly clever. So, what is it? Oh, did I go the wrong way? Oh, I added. So it intros. Now we've got an introduction of something highly important. Guys, wake up, listen, pay attention. So it's going to continue, like I said, the story, but not in a downward spiral of, we're going to end up in somewhere that's bad. No. It's going into a little bit more detail, and it's often referred to as the key of the Revelation or the Apocalypse. And it's suggesting that the tribulation began at Christ's ascension. Rather than, that's the suggestion. So, I'm going to deal with numbers first because we all know I'm really bad at numbers, as you saw earlier. And even Michael Heiser says that this part of the thing is actually mind-numbingly complex in terms of numbers. If you guys are numbers people and you want to hear and you want to understand more, I will send you the stuff. You can go read it if it fascinates you. For me, I just pulled out the threads. So what we don't understand with that numbers, the 1,260 days, and then that other phrase, a time, times, and then, it's a stupid thing. Well, for me it is. A time, times, and half a time. What does that even mean? So, like today, there were multiple calendars in those days. They had ritual calendars, solar calendars, lunar calendars. So like today we have school calendars, and even the school calendars don't kind of match. Then you've got the fiscal year for the accountants. I know February is an important time of year. It's that kind of different calendars that are on play here. Zonki's laughing at me. So the thing to remember, it's not about the literal number, it's about the symbolic value of the numbers. They loop back into Daniel. And there's evidence that Daniel was aware of these multiple calendars and that he actually seems to combine the two. It's what is like, one is a little short and one is a little long. So you kind of get that leap year thing going on where eventually they have to make up the days because it's just odd. It's that half thing. So 1,260, please don't ever ask me to do any math for you guys. I will fail miserably, is equal to 42 months. I can understand that. And then a time and a times and a times and a half a time, right? It's approximately, I think, 3.5 years. So both of them are saying the same thing. The focus isn't on the numbers. The focus is on the theological messaging. And not that the numbers don't work. The numbers actually do work. But that's if you're interested. And I'm not. So moving on. The idea we have to sit with, or let's say the mystery here that we're sitting with, is the timing we actually just don't know. And that's okay. So it's about the same thing, the day of the Lord or the final judgment. Kind of saying the same thing, alluding to from different parts of the Old Testament, same thing. And if you do the maths, and again, if you want to, please come ask me and I'll send you the stuff. It points to Jesus being the Passover, because then they add on a month and it's mind-numbingly, ridiculously, very clever, but not my thing. So the day of the Lord, however, doesn't point to the judgment in what we think it is. The day of the Lord points to the marriage of the marriage supper of the Lamb. It's pointing to a feast, a heavenly feast. It points to also the Jewish festival of the Feast of the Week, which is talking about harvest time. Once about the harvest time, they have a festival. So if you start making the links, it's incredible. So in other words, limited down to Louise's inability to do maths, those numbers represent a limited time. It's long, but it's limited. Okay, so I've just kind of pointed it down. I'm not the only one who says that, so it's not just me. So our key symbol, the person is, the sign that they're all wanting to highlight in this book and how John has written this, is the woman. She is the key to part of this unlocking of this. So she's supernaturally fed. She's nourished by God, and she's taken to a place prepared to by God. However, it's not in a comfortable space. It's the wilderness. Think of the Israelites in the wilderness, and they're traveling around, and they've got the temple of God with them as they move. That's what you're supposed to think of. Again, her tribulation is long, but it's limited. It's a picture of God's faithful community, both before Jesus and after Jesus is coming, right? In terms of his birth, death, burial, and ascension. It parallels both, it includes both, and you can fit both of Mary, which the Catholic Church overemphasizes, but it also includes Israel. So Israel is seen as a virgin of Zion who produces the Messiah in the Old Testament fulfillment. Israel is primary, but it doesn't exclude Mary, but it doesn't make her exclusive, right? So if you can live with all those kind of that stuff. So what does she represent? So her supernatural rescue is again linked to Israel's supernatural deliverance from Egypt. So the two eagle wings references back to Exodus 19. So we have to remember John is writing post-Jesus or after Jesus. So what he's doing as well is he's including followers of Jesus himself. He's including us. So you could say that we are a part of a Israel because we are God's people. So the messianic community now, and we can't think individually. It's always community-driven. It's always, let me say, the bigger picture. And that is now, we are defined through the New Testament lens of Jesus, right? And this is interesting. Birth pangs or labor in ancient Egypt, Jewish culture, equates with foreign kind of captivity. Remember, they were in exile. So that's why she was struggling to give birth, and that's why that language is there, right? So this comes to a very interesting point, is that she is an astronomical, is that how you pronounce it? Astronomical or a heavenly sign. So I have to be careful here, and I'm not saying, because of the position of the sun, her clothing, her sun, she's clothed with the sun, the moon's at her feet, she's got 12 stars as a crown, and obviously they're pointing to, I think it's Genesis 37, Joseph and his dream. They're pointing to that. It is referring to all of that. It's pointing to a high priest tradition and all of that. It's all yes. And we're not to confuse this with astrology or even modern day astrology. But in the ancient world, they were very faithful God, people who believed in Yahweh, who skywatched and read the skies as kind of signs for things that God was going to be doing, perhaps. So think of the Magi, not the three wise men, because it never states that there were three. Think of the wise men who eventually found Jesus because they were watching a sign in the sky. So that's kind of what is happening here. So it's divine activity that would impact the earth, and that it's discerned in the skies. This is not to be confused with prophecy either. It's not forth-telling. The Magi found Jesus once he was born, and he was almost perhaps I think about a year and a half, 18 months. He wasn't an infant when they found him. And then there is evidence and there is stuff where, and I can again give you the papers if you're interested in this, where they can today map out the position of the stars and pinpoint the season. Some guys are even claiming within hours of Jesus' birth, just by watching the star position. And he has a big clue. I'm not going to go into it, but it's not December 25th. But it's okay. God's not upset about that at all. So John is pinpointing astronomical, it sounds so weird, signs that are pointing to the birth of the Messiah. So all of that to say, the context of Revelation 12 is all about when Jesus was born. And just to add in a little kind of caveat, I'm not going to go into it a lot. You can come and chat to me afterwards. When it says the dragon swept a third of the angels with him down to earth, it is not talking about the fall, because we've just unpacked that the context is about the birth of Jesus, not about Genesis, when Satan deceived humanity. In fact, nowhere in the Bible does it say that Satan took a third of angels with him. That's just a little controversial. But come and talk to me, because I'd love to have a conversation with you about this. So, obviously, the key symbol, again, so we've got the woman, and now we've got the male child. But he's not a sign. The woman is the sign. He's a symbol. And I would say a symbol of hope. So it says, so the woman gave birth to a son, a male child, who was going to rule over all the nations with an iron rod, and her child was suddenly caught up to God and his throne. So the entire messaging, the theological point, central axis of Revelation, and it mentions Jesus as a one-liner. It was the entire snapshot of Jesus' life, but they also did it in other New Testament things. You got the things up there. John 13, John 16, Romans 1, 1 Timothy 3. So take a photo and go and have a look and see. What's interesting is that they talk about the birth of Jesus, and then they talk about his ascension, and they kind of leave his death, burial, and resurrection out of the picture. It's kind of almost assumed that you all know that. So the birth of this child, this male child, is John's way of going, actually, God's presence has come down to earth. He's returned, and he's returned in the form of a child. And this child is destined to rule over all nations. So this is where it gets good. This is where I'm like, oof, this is amazing stuff. So Jesus, this male child, is God's rightful ruling authority who has come. That's done. Who is ruling over the nations and kingdoms. And he is caught up with God and to his throne. Guess what? His rulership is unlimited and eternal. So now you start to see the differences between the great red dragon and a baby who's got all authority, power, and is ruling against. It seems like an unfair advantage to the great red dragon. So let's deal with this, the red dragon, the great red dragon, otherwise known as that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. Okay, can you hear? There's a little bit of sarcasm in the text. So he's the catalyst of all persecution, and he is the source of all evil. He represents all kingdoms of evil that persecute God's people. He is the accuser of God's people, and whose main means is deception, right? And then the little kind of thing is he gets defeated. He's not strong enough to prevail. So, as I said, the title is somewhat sarcastic. The Jewish guys the writers used to love doing this kind of thing. They would go, "Oh, that God over there, he's the Lord of the flies." It's the same kind of tone here. Oh, that's the great red dragon. He's ferocious. He's enraged. And he gets beaten by an infant. He's not autonomous. He and his agents, his cronies, can only persecute within a divinely prescribed period of time. His reign of terror is limited. He's limited by God, and he will be cut short, his time. That is a promise from God. He's the main instigator of this cosmic war that we find ourselves in. And it's in reaction to Jesus' birth and ascension. Him and his cronies were exiled from heaven, and they're thrown down onto the earth. It doesn't sound very fun for him. He's literally the source of a raging war on earth today. But he's lost his legal accusation against God's people. So a lot of this is like courtroom language. It's legal language. He lost the case. He still works in the means of deceiving the whole earth. He's called the father of lies for a reason. But God limits his time of rage, and then this great red dragon knows his time is short. So he's kind of the sore loser who's really not going to go down, kind of. And what he does is he can't get to Jesus. He can't get to the church or God's people. So he's going to go after her offspring. That's us. He comes at the church, and he does cause damage to the church, and it's only ways through lies and deception. But he cannot prevail over the church in any kind of ultimate way. So the threat to this dragon we've already been told what it is. It sits in chapter 11. So we give thanks to you, the Lord God Almighty, who is and who was, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raised, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding, and I've spoken all that, and for destroying the destroyers. That's where the threat sits for him. You see, because the Son of Man, and this is Daniel language, came to the Ancient of Days, the accuser loses his access and consequently his ability to accuse us. His legal power is removed. He isn't destroyed yet. Yet we still live in this already but not yet tension of the kingdom having begun, but not necessarily in its fullness. So it doesn't guarantee our comfort. It's put him like he is enraged. And he is literally obsessed with coming against us because he lost. It's one of those awful, like, you're a sore loser and you don't know, you're going to now, I can't get to you, going to take your, kind of come at your kids kind of scenario. So I don't want to leave you in that space. What is the theological point of Revelation, of this? What is it saying? It's saying that the supernatural protection of God's people through trials and persecution. You think of the Israelites in the wilderness. He provided for them every day. They had a cloud by day, fire at night. They were given food, provision. And in the center of their camp was God was with them. What's Jesus' name? Emmanuel, God with us. So the purpose of it is to encourage us to persevere despite what's going on around us. So it ends awkwardly, right? This dragon's standing on the seashore, kind of in the sand kind of thing. But guess what? His threat is a threat no longer, because guess who walks on water? Jesus walks on water. It's a picture of his authority over chaos. And the use of symbols in this prophetic sense causes us to look at the truth. And what's the truth? Who's our king? What's the reality? It's not an earthly reality. Our reality sits in heaven. So guess what? Sometimes we need to be shocked back into heavenly reality and going, that's why the images and the symbolism and everything is just almost too shocking. Shocks you back into, where do you stand? You're standing in heaven, and God is with you. So now the story gets just even better, more detailed, of how God is going to destroy the destroyer. It's the great reversal of this incredible picture of where we end up with the renewed heaven and the renewed earth, and then God is permanently with us and we are permanently with him. And all potential, listen to this, all potential for evil will be eradicated. Gone. There will no longer ever be the threat that that evil will be able to come back into the earth in the renewed heaven and the renewed earth. He eradicates it completely. But we are living in this tension. So how do we persevere in the here and now, living in the kingdom here, but the kingdom not quite yet? They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. We get to enter into and sit with Jesus and God in heaven because of the Lamb, the blood of the Lamb. That is it's like our ticket into heaven. There's nothing we did. It's all on God. That's the gospel. You can't outperform something that you didn't have to perform for. You can't make a mistake when it's got nothing to do with you. That's the beauty of the gospel. But then also by the word of their testimony. So what does that mean? And there's a clue in the text where it says, those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony about, not our testimony, it's about Jesus. It's about faith, trusting in that what Jesus did was enough and complete and done, even though we live in persecution and we're in a place where God has prepared for us, but it's still uncomfortable. And that's the hope of the gospel in the book of Revelation.